thanks very much, Nora. I appreciate being invited today. And just a slight correction, Sean Kong did go to Washington University. He was primarily the student of Kathleen McDermott, and I was a secondary advisor to Sean, and we do have some papers together. So I'm not disavowing you, Sean. I just setting the record straight. What I want to talk about today is trying to tell you in 15 minutes about 9 years of research, so that's not going to work too well, but I'll try to give you a flavor of what we've done. This is work funded by the Cognition and Student Learning Program of the Institute of Education Sciences. My main collaborators are Pooja Agarwal, who is here, wave your hand, and Kathleen McDermott, who's over here, and Mark McDaniel, who is not here. And we've developed this from doing laboratory research, which then we took into the classroom. And the principle that I will be talking about today is not brand new. Aristotle said it 2,300 years ago, exercise and repeatedly recalling a thing improves the memory. So he didn't know everything, though. He also said memory is in the heart, and that's where the expression of learning by heart comes from. So don't take everything he said right, but he did get this one right. Now what I want to do, there's about 100 years of history and psychology of studying this issue, sporadically off and on. I'm just going to tell you about one laboratory study that Jeff Karpicki and I published in Psychological Science a few years back. And we basically just asked, we had passages that were about science. They were not complicated pieces of science, they're more descriptive. And we simply asked, does this retrieval practice work in learning of passages about science? And is it more effective than simply restudying the material? After all, restudying is what, when we do surveys of what do students do when they study, they say they read, underline, highlight, and they reread. So that was our control group, basically what students normally do. So the students read these prose passages. They were just 250 to 400 or so words. Then they, just after they knew they were going to take a test, they then, these were college students, by the way, then they either reread the passage in one condition, or they simply took a test. So they were given the title of the passage, and we told them, recall as much as you can from the passage that you read. Essentially free recall, or like an essay test. They got no feedback on it. So in this practice test, the first quiz they took, they recalled about 70% of the idea units in the passage. Of course, in the reread group, they reread 100% of them. So right there's an exposure advantage for the reread group relative to the test group. But then we gave them a test that was delayed either just 5 minutes later. They took a test again, same test, got the title, asked to recall what they could, 2 days or 1 week later. So to have some delayed retention. And the tests were all between subjects so that one test couldn't influence the other test. So that was manipulated between subjects. Whether they reread or took a test was within subjects. So what did we find? Well, at 5 minutes, we find why students reread. Because if you reread something a whole lot, if you cram right before a test, you do okay. In fact, you do better than the study plus test group. So that repeated exposure for the reread subjects helps them as long as you test them immediately. But if you bring them back 2 days later and you ask them to recall the passage, they do the opposite. Now the group that took an initial test does much better than the group that reread. And the same thing happens when you go out a week. So what we often think of education as a process of getting information into students. Really, what you want them to be able to do is to use it, to be able to get it out of the students too. And so what retrieval practice does is to practice that very skill they need, use the information. And if you look at the amount of forgetting, we have crossover interactions. You show from rereading, which is what, again, students say they do when you survey them, you get much more forgetting than if you get them to do this kind of active retrieval. So this is an old effect that's been called the testing effect. Testing of memory not only assesses what we know, it changes it. usually makes it better, not always. There is a phenomenon called retrieval-induced forgetting, but let me not get sidetracked. So many studies show testing can enhance later performance more than additional study, which is often the control condition. And Jeff Karpicki and I wrote a big review of this in Perspectives on Psychological Science, also in 2006. So this laboratory work, which we and many other people did, led us to propose to the Institute of Educational Sciences what we've come to call the Columbia Middle School Project. Columbia, this is in Columbia, Illinois. It's a middle school there. It's nothing special, not a fancy private school. We happened to have a good contact there, so we got in. And we have now expanded to the high school, but we have over the years tested, I'll talk about 6th to 8th grades. We've tested a variety of subject areas. This is not a technique that works only with science or only with history. It works with a number of different subject areas, not all in our hands yet, but many. Over the last 7 years, we've tested about 1,500 students, sometimes more than once. Sometimes they've been in one experiment in the fall and a different one in the spring. And we've conducted more than 30 experiments. So as I say, I can't summarize all this to you today. Here are 4 papers that, well, 3 of them have been published. One is under submission right now, the one that Kathleen McDermott is first author on. And what I want to do today is talk about this McDaniel et al. Paper, the first one, because that involves 8th grade science. So just to give you a flavor of what we do, how we got into the schools, how we did this, everybody, before I did this, everybody said, well, how come there are not more cognitive psychologists working in the schools? I always thought, gee, that's an interesting question. Now I discovered the answer, because it's really, really hard. You've got district superintendents, and you've got principals, and you've got parents, and you've got teachers, and you've got your own university's IRB, and they're all underage, so you've got to get parents' permission for everything. Anyway, you all know that, because you're all doing this kind of work, but kind of blindsided me how hard it all was. So what we did, the materials we use are not specially created materials. We said, we'll use whatever you're using in the schools, and we looked at all their books, and they're actually quite good books. I was amazed at how sophisticated they were and how little 8th grade science I actually knew. So we said, we'll be minor inconvenience to you, we hope. We will take your textbook materials, we'll take whatever lectures the teacher's using, and all we want to do is add some low-stakes quizzes. Won't have to count for the students' grades. We use student response systems, clicker systems. And we distinguished between, we took the teacher's test, give us the test you used last year that you plan to use this year, and we simply selected a few items from the eventual test that would be quizzed a few times, low-stakes quizzes, no, it doesn't count, just in class, and then others that would not be. And so it would just be business as usual. And then we would measure performance on chapter tests. How well do they know the material, say, 2 weeks or a month later? Then how well do they know it at the end of the semester? And in a few cases, we've been able to give them surprise tests at the end of the year. All of our experiments use a within students design. We don't have to worry about randomizing the classrooms and all that. All of our students are their own controls. Doesn't totally eliminate problems because students miss days, and so then you got the problem they miss the manipulation or something. So basically the idea was all within students though, which makes for very powerful designs, especially with the large numbers we have, even when we have to eliminate people who miss days. And so basically we're asking, can we improve their knowledge of the material on a final test? As I mentioned, this is not exactly a typical question, but we had questions that are process-oriented, some that are fact-oriented, which is the following as an example of a heterotroph. See, it's hard to remember 8th grade science, isn't it? It's mushrooms. Here's basically what we did that we had in some of our experiments, this McDaniel et al. Experiment. We gave them a pre-quiz, so the teacher, whenever a quiz was given, the teacher left the classroom, by the way. There's 6 sections of 8th grade science. We could counterbalance all the items across all the sections. We have great research assistants who did all this for us under Pooja Agarwal's direction. And so we can counterbalance all of that. We give them a quiz ahead of time. They get about 43% on that quiz, a little bit better than chance at 4 alternative quizzes. They then get the standard treatment. They are assigned to do reading, whether they do it or not, who knows, we can't know. They get lectures in class, and then they get a quiz a day or 2 later, and then they get a review quiz yet later. So for some material, they've been quizzed 3 times. For other material, they got just the standard, what they would have gotten had the class not used quizzes. And so then we wanted to ask, what would happen when we tested our dependent measures in these experiments are what the students got grades on, their actual criteria tests. So at the end of the chapter test, for the control group, the not quiz group, they got about 80%, and the teacher told us that's about where our students always are. They like it that way. The tests were kind of modeled to be 80%. For those items that we quizzed, they got essentially further than halfway to the top of the scale as they could, kind of a 50% effect. They got up to 92%, and the grading scale used in the school, this would be going from a C+, B- range to an A- range. Obviously, since this is only a subset of the items, we didn't raise all the students' grades. And this would be a few days after the review quiz. Were they able to retain the information? So we also have tests at the end of the semester. These did count for the students' grades. So they were studying in between, of course, and doing all kinds of whatever they do. We still get an effect at the end of the semester, obviously much smaller, but still there. And then in this particular experiment, at the end of the school year, the teacher was willing to let us have some time, totally unannounced quiz to the students. They hadn't been grading this stuff. This is stuff they had in October and November in the fall, and now we're testing them at the end of May the next year to see if we could still get an effect. And again, we show forgetting over time, no surprise, but we still get an effect there. So this is just a sample of one of our 30 experiments that I'm reporting here, just one of the ones that was in this McDaniel paper. Let me try to summarize some of the area of our research by simply posing some questions and answering them, questions that we've asked. So does retrieval practice improve long-term classroom learning? Yes, we've done experiments, almost every experiment in the middle school, not everyone gets this effect. I can tell you our thoughts on that later. But yes, we get this, and we've also, Mark McDaniel in particular has done this in college classes and gotten big effects. Certainly doing this research has totally changed the way I teach, Kathleen teaches, probably Sean and Pooja teach also. Lots more quizzing than I ever used to give. Does retrieval practice improve performance relative to rereading? The experiment I just showed you didn't have a rereading control group. It was quizzing versus just regular standard practice. If we had inserted, in fact we have inserted in a number of experiments, just reading the statements instead of taking a quiz, that doesn't have much effect. If you ask the if you ask the question to make people think about it and then select an answer, it has much more effect than simply rereading the statement. So it's not just a mere exposure effect. So we find that on delay tests. Often, actually, rereading has almost no effect. Mark McDaniel has a couple of really interesting papers on that. Almost hard for me to believe how little the impact is. When should retrieval practice be administered? And Sean will probably be talking about this after me, but the best is after a delay. You need to engage in some effort to retrieve. If you remember the old program learning instruction, I had it in the 1960s because I'm that old. It had the right idea. It quizzed people, but the quiz was trivial because Skinner and everybody was worried about student making errors. And the research shows, don't worry about students making errors. They'll recover as long as you give them feedback. So quizzes should be delayed after exposure to the material to have a positive effect. If you test immediately, you often get no effect. Is feedback necessary? Yes, it's absolutely critical. I am embarrassed at the number of quizzes I gave, or tests I gave in intro psych where I never gave feedback because I wanted to protect my test bank. I've since done research showing that if people make a wrong answer but they think they're right, just like you can learn positive stuff from quizzes, well, you can learn the wrong stuff from quizzes too. So anyway, yes, feedback corrects errors of omission and errors of commission, both of which are critically important. And also, even when you're right but you're not really very sure, it helps you there too, as Andrew Butler has shown in some other work. Does retrieval practice improve transfer to new material? The holy grail of all of our research, trying to show transfer. And here, and the answer is mixed. Jason Chan has some very nice work with Kathleen McDermott, and then on his own, in his dissertation and other papers showing testing on some things in a complex passage can actually boost and help you on other things. Andrew Butler has shown that quizzing can often help people do inference-type questions later. But other people aren't getting those effects, and it's too early to say yet where truth lies there. Does retrieval practice improve higher-order thinking skills? Can people take this? My hope is that people, once they know the facts better, they'll be able to take them and write an essay about them or to use them. And Pooja Agarwal has been looking at this question, and the answer in her hands is sometimes. If the practice quizzes require these higher-order skills, then you can get transfer to new questions. But if the practice tests just involve remembering facts, she doesn't get much transfer to higher-order quizzes. Another point, it doesn't just work with multiple-choice quizzes. In fact, it works at least as well with short answer and short essay type questions as in roediger and Karpicki, and Sean Conley actually has some evidence that it's better with these kinds. So finally, yes, there will be a test, but you'll go get to test me, but first Sean's going to get to talk. Thank you.
While we're switching over, I've looked at this study before, and then the first study that you quoted, the nature of that first test, was that test, I mean, the second one was, what can you recall? Everybody got that? Right.
Yeah.
So then the first test that they were given, what was the nature of that test?
Same test. It was simply giving the title and saying, how much can you remember about this topic? So they were the same kind of test. It was like an essay or a free recall. It was just, remember you read this passage about such and such, we just gave them the title. Please recall all that you can from that passage.
Okay, so there was no feedback then
No
to
feedback.
those students about
No
what they could do?
So recalling, especially in, for essay, is a very, what I call constructive and generative task. And comparing to rereading, which in my language is a very passive task, have you tried comparing to some other generative tasks to see whether retesting itself is good, or is it a matter
Jeff
of...
Karpicki has a paper in Science comparing testing of this sort to concept mapping and testing blue concept mapping away. So anyway, it's in Science 2011. So let me stop and let Sean go.